Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The incident at Tom's Diner. The southern town of Rosewood was a quiet, tightly knit community, where everyone knew everyone else, and where the passing of seasons seemed to dictate the rhythm of life. It was the sort of town where folks held open doors for one another, children played in the streets without fear, and the local diner, Tom's Diner, was the heart of it all. For decades, the diner had served as a gathering spot, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon could cure just about anything, and the worn wooden booths echoed with laughter, gossip, and the occasional argument. John Carter had been a regular for years. As a local veteran, he was known and respected by all who frequented the diner. His graying hair and weathered face bore the marks of his service, but his warm smile and kind eyes made him a familiar, friendly figure. John had seen the world and fought for it, but his most cherished memories were of the quiet life he'd built for himself in Rosewood. A simple life, shaped by the rhythms of small-town living, the love of his children, and the respect of his peers. But on this day, something felt different. The sun hung heavy in the sky as John pulled his old, rusted pickup truck into the diner's gravel parking lot. He had been up early, taking a walk around the perimeter of his property, checking on his garden and the chicken coop. Now, the pull of Tom's Diner, a place where he'd found comfort and routine, drew him inside. As John stepped out of his truck, he could feel the familiar ache in his knees. The long years of military service and the years that followed had left their mark on his body, but it was a price he had been willing to pay. He glanced around at the sleepy streets of Rosewood, the town that had been his refuge after leaving the military, and made his way toward the diner's weathered sign. The bell above the door jingled softly as he pushed it open and entered. Normally, the sight of Tom's Diner greeted him like a warm embrace, but today was different. The usual clinking of silverware and low murmur of conversation seemed to fade as soon as John walked in. The usual chatter of old-timers and truckers stopped, replaced by a quiet, almost palpable tension. John, ever the steady figure, felt a sudden tightness in his chest, a subtle unease that seemed to cling to the air around him. He shook it off as nothing more than the result of his weary body. Maybe he was just getting old. Yet, as he walked toward his usual seat at the counter, the eyes of the other patrons seemed to follow his every move. He nodded politely to a few familiar faces, but they quickly turned away, the silence hanging heavy in the air. Tom Harris, the owner of the diner, emerged from the kitchen. Normally, Tom's face would light up when he saw John, his old friend and regular customer. But today, Tom's expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and distant. John gave him a friendly nod, as he always did, but Tom's gaze remained fixed on him, an unsettling tightness around his mouth. "What can I get for you today, John?" Tom asked, his voice lacking its usual warmth. John smiled, sensing something was off, but choosing to ignore it. "Just the usual, Tom. A cup of coffee and a slice of that famous apple pie of yours." Tom's face hardened, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if bracing himself for something. "I'm afraid we're out of pie today," he said flatly. John raised an eyebrow. "But I see a fresh one right there on the counter, Tom." Tom's jaw clenched. His eyes, which usually held a friendly gleam, now glimmered with something darker. "I said we're out of pie," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "In fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." The words hit John like a slap to the face. His stomach churned as confusion mixed with an unmistakable sting of hurt. He had been coming to Tom's Diner for years, decades, in fact, and had never been treated like this. His mind raced for an explanation, but the thought of being unwelcome in a place he had once considered a second home made it hard to focus. "What do you mean, Tom? What's going on? Is there something I've done to upset you?" John's voice trembled slightly as he stood up, his knees aching as he tried to make sense of it all. Tom's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, John saw a venomous sneer twist across his face. "You've done plenty, just by walking in here," Tom said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't serve your kind in my establishment. Now get out, before I call the authorities." John's heart sank as he stood frozen in place, his mind struggling to comprehend the words that had just been spoken. The room felt like it was closing in on him. The air was thick with disbelief and tension. The other patrons, who had once greeted him warmly, now avoided his gaze, some of them shifting nervously in their seats. It wasn't just Tom's behavior that struck John, it was the looks from the other patrons, the uncomfortable shuffling in their seats, the silence that screamed louder than words ever could. They had all witnessed the exchange. They had all seen him humiliated in front of everyone. And not a single person said a word. It was as if they were complicit in the cruelty. John's hand shook as he gathered his things, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. As he made his way to the door, he felt the sting of betrayal sear into his soul. He had never imagined that Tom, a man who had always been friendly, would treat him with such disdain. But as John stepped into the sunlight and the door swung shut behind him, he could hear a voice, a young woman from one of the tables, call out in protest. "This isn't right," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. But Tom, quick to silence dissent, turned on her with fury. "This is my diner," he shouted. "I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The young woman hesitated, clearly torn between standing up for what was right and the fear of Tom's wrath. Her gaze flickered between Tom and John, her shame evident as she slowly sat back down, her shoulders slumped in resignation. John stepped out onto the sidewalk, his heart heavy with confusion and anger. He didn't know what had just happened, didn't know why Tom had turned on him like that, but he could feel a fire starting to kindle in his chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Little did he know, the humiliation he had just faced would set off a chain of events that would ripple through the town of Rosewood and change everything. And what Tom had failed to realize was that he had just crossed paths with a man who wasn't about to let prejudice stand in his way. As John walked toward his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a quiet resolve, the weight of the moment hung heavy. This was not the end of his story. It was just the beginning. The unseen consequences. As John Carter drove through the sun-baked streets of Rosewood, the world around him seemed to blur. His mind raced with a mix of confusion, hurt, and something else, something that had begun to rise within him unnoticed until this moment. It wasn't just the humiliation that stung, or even the injustice of being treated as less than human. It was the deep betrayal he felt from someone he had once considered a friend. Tom Harris had always been the owner of Tom's Diner, the one place where people could find solace, good food, and a safe space away from the troubles of the world. But today, that place had become a battleground, and John, a man who had given his youth and vigor to serving his country, was left to fight a battle he hadn't anticipated. The old truck's engine hummed steadily beneath him, but John's mind was far from calm. He knew that Rosewood was a small town, a place where things had a way of spreading like wildfire. Tom's actions would not be easily forgotten, and as much as John wanted to retreat into his own world and forget about the day's events, he knew he couldn't. Not when so many were watching. By the time John pulled up to his modest home, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He had been tested before. In war, in life, and even now, in his small, peaceful town. The difference this time was that the enemy wasn't foreign or faceless, it was a betrayal that hit closer to home. A betrayal that threatened not only his dignity but also the values he had worked so hard to uphold throughout his life. As John sat in his truck for a moment, staring out at the lush green yard that surrounded his house, he felt a strange calm. The storm inside him had subsided, replaced by a sense of purpose. He wouldn't let Tom's actions define him. He wouldn't let the hatred of one man change the community he loved. His eyes hardened with determination. There had to be a way to bring this injustice to light. Not just for himself, but for anyone who had been made to feel less than human by Tom's kind of cruelty. And so, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, John began to make his plan. Back in the diner, Tom Harris wiped his hands on his apron, his mind racing. He had expected a backlash, of course. People would talk. They always did. But he didn't expect the storm of emotion that seemed to swirl in the air ever since John had left. The voices had risen in the diner, even though they were hushed whispers now. And when the last of the patrons had paid their bills and left in the wake of John's humiliating exit, Tom had locked the door, thrown the chairs up onto the tables, and sat in the emptiness of his diner, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. Tom had never considered himself to be a prejudiced man. He had grown up in a family where the struggles of hard work and perseverance had been paramount. He believed in the value of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But when John Carter had walked in that day, something inside Tom had snapped, something he hadn't even realized was there. A prejudice that had festered, unnoticed, for years. Perhaps it was the years of seeing change sweep through the town, unsettling the old ways of life. Perhaps it was the endless news stories about the government's initiatives to address civil rights, veterans' affairs, and racial equality. Whatever the reason, Tom couldn't shake the feeling of resentment that had risen within him when John had entered the diner. It was something deeper than just a dislike, it was an irrational fear, a fear he couldn't quite understand or explain. As Tom sat alone in the diner, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a heavy cloak. There had been a time, long ago, when he would have brushed off any personal vendetta or disagreement with a neighbor. But this was different. This was public, and worse, it was a direct challenge to the moral fabric of the town. Back in Washington, D.C., miles away from the small town of Rosewood, Michael Carter was sitting in his office, his thoughts far from the day's work. Michael, a U.S. Senator, had worked tirelessly throughout his career to pass legislation that would ensure equal rights for every American, particularly veterans and marginalized groups. He had fought for the betterment of society and, in doing so, had become a respected voice in the fight for justice. But today, as he listened to the phone call from a family friend, his calm, composed demeanor cracked. "Michael, you need to hear this," the voice on the other end of the line said. "Your father. Tom Harris just humiliated him at the diner. He refused him service. And the whole town's talking about it." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. His first instinct was to act. He had the power, the resources, and the platform to make Tom Harris pay for what he had done. As he listened to the details, his mind raced, considering all the possible ways to use his position to bring justice to his father. He could issue a public statement, call the press, or even bring legal action against the diner. That would teach Tom Harris a lesson. But something held him back. Michael knew that responding with pure legal force might not achieve the kind of change he wanted. It would likely just entrench the divisions, making Tom a martyr in the eyes of those who already supported him. Michael needed something more, something that would address the deeper issues of prejudice that ran through the heart of Rosewood, not just the actions of one misguided man. After a long pause, Michael's voice was calm but firm. "I'll handle this. But not with a hammer. I'm going to approach this carefully. We'll get to the root of this." He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. It was clear to him now that Tom Harris's actions weren't just an isolated incident. They were a symptom of something larger, something that had been brewing in Rosewood for years. And Michael Carter, a man who had spent his life fighting for equality, knew that if he was going to fix it, he would have to go deeper than just addressing Tom's actions. He had to change the mindset that had led to that moment in the diner. The next morning, as the sun rose over Rosewood, the town was on edge. Rumors about John's treatment had spread like wildfire, igniting a quiet but growing anger in the community. People had begun to question the actions of Tom Harris, and the first signs of protest had already begun. A small group of townsfolk had gathered outside the diner, holding signs with slogans like "No to Racism" and "Equality for All." The message was simple: Rosewood would not stand by and allow such treatment to go unchallenged. Tom stood behind the counter, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared for another busy day. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Michael Carter, the senator, and his possible response. He had heard rumors of Michael's involvement in the civil rights movement, his advocacy for veterans, and his work in creating policies that promoted fairness and equality. What if Michael decided to take this further? What if the whole town turned against him? The door jingled, and Tom looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway was a man he didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with an air of authority that made Tom uneasy. The man's gaze was piercing, and for the first time that morning, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The man walked toward the counter, his footsteps steady. "Are you Tom Harris?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight of unspoken power. Tom swallowed hard. "Yes, that's me," he said, his voice shaky. The man nodded. "I'm Michael Carter. John Carter's son. I think we need to talk." Tom's blood ran cold. The reckoning. The air in Tom's diner felt thick, charged with tension as Michael Carter stepped closer to the counter. His presence filled the room, an aura of authority and quiet power emanating from him. Tom Harris, usually so confident in his establishment, suddenly felt small, exposed. He had been expecting some form of retaliation, but the reality of the situation, of facing John Carter's son, was something entirely different. Michael studied Tom with a calm intensity, his eyes steady as he took in the diner's worn-down fixtures and the thick silence that had settled in the room. The other patrons, who had been enjoying their meals moments before, now seemed to shrink into their seats, their eyes darting nervously between the two men. The sudden appearance of the senator's son had turned what was once an ordinary morning into a moment of reckoning, and everyone in the room could feel it. Tom swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. He had faced countless situations before, from tough negotiations to the daily grind of running a diner in a small town, but this was different. This was more than just a confrontation, it was an indictment of everything he had thought he stood for. For a moment, he almost wished he could close the door, lock it, and pretend this was all a bad dream. But there was no escape now. "I suppose you're here to give me a lecture, are you?" Tom's voice was gruff, his usual bravado returning, albeit tinged with uncertainty. "You don't understand, Michael. This is my place. My rules. If I don't want to serve someone, that's my prerogative. I've been doing this for decades." Michael's gaze remained unflinching. He wasn't here to argue with Tom, he was here to make him understand. "I don't need to lecture you, Tom," he said evenly. "But what I do need you to understand is that what you did to my father wasn't just a personal slight, it was a reflection of something much bigger. Something you may not even realize is festering inside of you." Tom bristled at the accusation, but Michael continued, his tone calm, yet unmistakably firm. "Your actions, yesterday, were a direct assault on the dignity of a man who has spent his life serving this country, fighting for the freedoms you enjoy. My father, John Carter, has earned every ounce of respect he gets. And for you to treat him the way you did, publicly humiliate him, is something I can't overlook." The words hit Tom like a slap, but he wasn't ready to back down. "I don't owe him anything. I don't owe anyone anything. The world's changed, Michael, but I haven't. You want me to apologize for standing up for my own beliefs? For running my diner the way I see fit?" Michael's expression softened, but only slightly. "This isn't about beliefs, Tom. This is about respect. Humanity. It's about understanding that every person who walks through your door, regardless of their skin color or their past, deserves to be treated with dignity. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time to reevaluate what kind of man you want to be." The weight of Michael's words settled on Tom, heavier than any physical blow. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. There was nothing he could say that would justify his actions. Not anymore. For a long moment, the two men stood there in silence, the tension in the air palpable. Michael didn't break eye contact, holding Tom's gaze until the older man finally looked away, his eyes dropping to the counter. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly. "I don't know what to say," Tom muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The harsh edge had left his voice, replaced by something softer, regretful. Michael nodded slowly. "I didn't expect you to have all the answers, Tom. But I did expect you to recognize the gravity of what you've done. What you did to my father wasn't just an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. A pattern of people who think they can treat others like this and get away with it. Tom's mind was swirling now. The anger and defensiveness that had shielded him from the truth for so long were beginning to crumble. He knew that what Michael was saying was right. Deep down, he had always known. He had witnessed the slow erosion of the town's unity over the years, and he had turned a blind eye to it, telling himself that nothing had changed. But something had changed. Something within him had shifted in the face of Michael's quiet determination. "I never meant for it to go this far," Tom said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just didn't want things to change." Michael's face softened further, but there was still resolve in his eyes. "Change is hard. But it's necessary, Tom. You've spent so many years serving this community, but it's time to serve it in a new way, one that embraces everyone. Every race. Every creed. It's time for Rosewood to heal, and that starts with you." Tom nodded slowly, though the weight of Michael's words was still sinking in. The reality of the situation began to unfold in his mind. He had let his personal biases cloud his judgment, had let years of stubbornness and ignorance blind him to the truth. But this wasn't just about his personal feelings. This was about the fabric of the town, the lives of the people who had trusted him. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. "What do you want me to do?" Tom finally asked, his voice barely audible. It was a question he never thought he would ask, but here he was, standing before the son of the man he had wronged, hoping for a chance at redemption. Michael took a deep breath, his expression resolute. "What I want is for you to apologize to my father. Not just to him, but to this town. Let them know you understand why what you did was wrong. And then you need to take action. We can't keep pretending that things like this don't matter. We need to make sure that what happened to my father doesn't happen to anyone else in this town." Tom met Michael's gaze again, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope in the young senator's eyes. There was no anger there, no judgment, only the quiet, powerful desire for change. For redemption. Tom stood up straighter, his shoulders squared. He didn't know how he would make things right, but he knew he had to start somewhere. "I'll do it," he said firmly. "I'll apologize. And I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Michael gave a small, approving nod, though he said nothing more. He knew that this was only the beginning, but it was a start. Tom Harris had taken the first step toward redemption. Whether the town would follow suit remained to be seen, but Michael believed that if people could begin to acknowledge their mistakes, they could begin to heal. As Michael turned to leave, Tom watched him go. There was a strange sense of peace settling over the diner, as though the very air around him had shifted. The weight of his prejudice, of his fear, was beginning to lift. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Outside, the protesters were still gathered, their signs held high, their voices a chorus of determination. The town was waking up to the truth, and change was on the horizon. Tom Harris had made a mistake. But now, he was ready to make things right. Back at home, John Carter sat in his living room, quietly watching the news on the television, unaware of the powerful chain of events set into motion. He didn't know it yet, but the storm he had walked out of that diner had already begun to change the town, the people, and even the man who had wronged him. As he sipped his coffee, a sense of calm washed over him. He had done his part. He had stood up for himself, for every person who had ever faced discrimination. Now, it was up to the town to decide what kind of place it wanted to be. But one thing was certain: Rosewood would never be the same. The dawn of a new beginning. The days that followed Michael Carter's confrontation with Tom Harris were tense ones for the small town of Rosewood. The ripple effects of John Carter's mistreatment at Tom's diner had reverberated through the community, shaking its foundations in ways no one had expected. What began as a single act of prejudice now had the potential to change the lives of everyone in the town, and Tom Harris was at the heart of that change. After Michael's visit, Tom had spent several restless nights, unable to sleep as he turned over his actions in his mind. The words Michael had spoken echoed in his ears, gnawing at him. It wasn't just about John Carter anymore, it was about everything he had built and what he had been blind to for so long. He had spent his entire life running a business, but had he ever really paid attention to the people who made up the fabric of his town? Had he ever stopped to truly listen to what was happening around him? By the time Tom arrived at the diner the following morning, the weight of his decision to change had fully settled on him. He could no longer hide behind his biases, his outdated views. He had to own up to his mistakes, not just to John Carter, but to the entire community he had served for decades. He wasn't sure how it would go, or if anyone would believe that he was genuinely remorseful, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go on pretending everything was fine. He had to make things right. As the sun rose over the town, casting a golden light over the streets, Tom stood at the front door of his diner, facing the small crowd gathered outside. They were holding signs that read "End Racism" and "Equality for All," their voices a steady hum of hope and defiance. Some of the protesters were familiar faces, regulars who had been coming to Tom's diner for years, others were newcomers, passionate about the cause of racial justice. Tom had been avoiding this moment for days, but now it was time to face the truth. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped outside, his heart pounding in his chest. The murmurs of the crowd hushed when they saw him. Tom had been a fixture in Rosewood for as long as anyone could remember, but today, he wasn't the man they all knew. Today, he was a man who had to answer for his actions. "I've made a mistake," Tom's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, as he looked around at the crowd. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his apron, but he didn't look away. "What I did to John Carter was wrong. It was hurtful, disrespectful, and it was based on prejudices I thought I had long buried. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I realize now that I have a responsibility, not just to this diner, but to the people of Rosewood, to do better." There was a long silence as Tom's words hung in the air. Some of the protesters exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the sudden confession. But Tom wasn't finished. He knew that an apology wasn't enough. He needed to show that he had truly changed, that he was committed to learning and growing. "I've spent years turning a blind eye to the injustices around me," Tom continued, his voice stronger now, carrying the weight of his realization. "I've let my personal biases and my pride define how I ran this place. I've hurt people, and I've allowed that hurt to fester. I'm sorry for that. I don't expect anyone to forgive me right away, but I'm asking for the chance to make things right. Starting now, I will do everything I can to foster a space here where everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, feels welcome. This is my promise to you." The crowd was quiet, the gravity of Tom's words settling in. Finally, a few people began to clap. Then, others joined in, the sound of tentative applause growing louder. Tom's heart raced, but it was a different kind of nervousness now. It wasn't fear of being rejected, it was the fear of failure, of not living up to the promise he had just made. But as he looked at the people gathered outside his diner, he felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the end of the road, it was the beginning. The days following Tom's public apology were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The town of Rosewood, which had once been defined by its divisions and prejudices, began to heal in small but significant ways. Tom opened his diner's doors with a new sense of humility. He made a commitment to listen more, to learn, and to open up spaces for conversations about race and equality in the town that had long been silenced. The walls of his diner became a forum for difficult but necessary discussions, and the community began to see the changes in Tom that they hadn't thought were possible. Meanwhile, John Carter, though still processing the events of the past week, had found a sense of peace. He didn't know how to fully articulate it, but the chain of events had awakened something in him, a sense of hope for the future. As a veteran who had fought for the freedoms of his country, he had seen so much injustice in his lifetime. But there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just about him, and it wasn't just about the town. It was about the next generation, the ones who would grow up without the same prejudices and fears that had once held them all back. Michael, too, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had done what he could to ensure that his father's dignity was restored, but he also knew that true change came from within. Rosewood had taken its first step toward healing. The town had learned a valuable lesson, not just about racism, but about forgiveness and understanding. Michael knew that his work was far from done. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. It was on a bright Saturday morning, nearly a month after the incident at Tom's Diner, that a special event was held in Rosewood. The town had organized a community gathering, a celebration of unity and healing, where people from all walks of life could come together. Tom, standing at the front of his diner, looked out over the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude. The once divided town had come together, not through speeches or policies, but through something much simpler: conversation. John and Michael Carter were there, of course, along with many of the diner's regulars and newcomers alike. They had all come to celebrate the town's progress, to witness the change they had all been a part of. The event wasn't without its challenges. There were still disagreements, still old wounds that needed to be healed, but as the day wore on, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to realize that change wasn't just about what happened in one moment, it was about what came next. It was about continuing to show up, day after day, and fighting for the future that everyone in the town deserved. As the sun began to set over Rosewood, casting a warm, golden glow over the crowd, Tom found himself standing next to John Carter. They exchanged a quiet look, one that spoke volumes about their journey, about the road they had traveled together, even though they hadn't known it until recently. The pain, the hurt, the healing, it had all come full circle. "We're not there yet, Tom," John said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "But we're getting there." Tom nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah. We are." And with that, as the stars began to twinkle above, the town of Rosewood stood united, no longer defined by its past but by the promise of a brighter, more inclusive future. The lesson of forgiveness, of understanding, had been learned. And in the end, it was the courage to change that would make all the difference.